Well, going on from that, he comes to a subsection on analogy and revelation. Quote, Van Til rather affirms that we can have no knowledge of God unless he voluntarily reveals himself. Well, that does not require our concept to differ from God's. It simply means that God reveals his knowledge to us. Then we have his knowledge. Frame insists that we can derive knowledge from an observation of nature. And the quotation is, extra scriptural information to interpret Scripture. As we need, or at least we use, extra scriptural information to interpret Scripture. But neither he nor Van Til explain how this is possible. This is a big gap in their theory. But Frame insists, quote, thus we can use such data fearlessly and thankfully. That is, we can use extra scriptural information fearlessly and thankfully. Does that mean that we should hold to the discarded theory of gravitation? Does it mean that we should hold to Newtonian's idea that motion proceeds in a straight line? Does it mean that we must accept Einstein, who says motion never proceeds in a straight line? And that there is no gravitation? Are space and time independent frameworks, as Newton said? Or are they not independent, as Einstein says? And who knows what the science will be a year from now? Now, Frame admits that man's knowledge of nature is distorted by sin. Quote, man's normal activity of interpreting the universe has been distorted by sin. Well, in that case, how can we use it fearlessly and thankfully? But I am not particularly interested in the distortion of knowledge by sin. I do admit noetic effects of sin, however. But my theory is that even Adam, before he fell, could never have arrived at any laws of nature whatever, because our physical abilities do not enable us to do that, and laboratory experimentation is an imposition of mathematical choices on observations that do not compel any particular proposition. Continuing to quote from Frame, even when we use extra scriptural information, as we must, that's part of his wording, even when we use extra scriptural information as we must to understand Scripture, we must hold loosely to this information. Oh, I thought he said on the previous page, we can use it fearlessly and thankfully. Now he says we have to use it loosely. And if we use it loosely, then even loosely, we must reject the principle that Scripture must be interpreted by Scripture, which I think is the Reformed position. And, of course, this matter of loosely, that just wrecks Frame's whole scheme. Now, further, on page 321, quote, our knowledge is limited both by our created status and by God's sovereign limitation of revelation. Therefore, we can expect to find paradox also in Scripture. Let me read this remarkable example of logic again. Our knowledge is limited both by our created status and by God's sovereign limitation of revelation. Well, I have no objection to that sentence. But look what he implies from, what he infers from it. Therefore, we can expect to find paradox also in Scripture. Now, that's perfectly fallacious. The therefore doesn't hold at all. Now, it is no doubt true that there are apparent contradictions in Scripture, but only apparent ones. We have to ask, apparent to whom? They appear ultimately irreconcilable to unbelievers because unbelievers have a false view of the foundations of logic. But the apparent contradictions are also apparent to all men, believers and unbelievers. Wait a minute, I better do this over again. This is all quotation. I think maybe you thought I was speaking for myself. These are Frame's words. I'll go through them. There are apparent contradictions in Scripture, but only apparent ones. Apparent to whom? They appear ultimately irreconcilable to unbelievers because unbelievers have a false view of the foundation of logic. But the apparent contradictions are also apparent to all men, believers and unbelievers alike, because of their finitude. End of quote. Well, many unbelievers will admit consistency in places where Frame finds paradoxes. This is more often the case with believers. A paradox, in my opinion at any rate, a paradox is simply a confusion in one's mind, and hence what is paradoxical to one man is not paradoxical to another. And my standard example of this is a physics laboratory, an elementary laboratory, where the professor will tell you that the weight of water in this container is half the weight of the water in this container. And yet the pressure with the lesser water is twice the pressure with twice the pressure of the greater amount of water. And that sounds queer to some people. They asked some of the students, well, how can water, which is half the weight of another beaker of water, have twice the pressure on the bottom? This is a paradox. This is one that's very easily solved. Any of you know the solution? You've had physics? Yeah, tell them. Exactly, yeah. Pressure is a function of height, not of weight. But most people make a mistake and think it's a function of the weight. And but two of us here don't see any paradox anymore.